The serpent flowed through the water, effortlessly riding the wake of the ship. Its scaled body shone like a dolphin's, but more iridescently blue. The head it lifted clear of the water was wickedly quilled with dangling barbels like those on a ratfish. Its deep blue eyes met Brashen's and widened in expectation like a woman's when she flirts. Then the maw of the creature opened wide, brilliantly scarlet and lined with row upon row of inward slanting teeth. It gaped open, big enough to take in a standing man. The dangling barbs stood up suddenly around the serpent's head, a lion's mane of poisonous darts. The scarlet mouth came darting toward him to engulf him. Darkness surrounded Brashen, and the cold carrion stench of the creature's mouth. He flung himself away wildly with an incoherent cry. His hands met wood, and with the touch of it, relief flooded him. Nightmare. He drew a shuddering breath. He listened to the familiar sounds, the creaking of the vivacious timbers, the breathing of other sleeping men, and the slapping of the water against the hull. Overhead, he could hear the barefoot patter of someone springing to answer a command. All was familiar. All was safe. He took a deep breath of air thick with the scent of tarry timbers, the stink of men living long in close quarters, and beneath it all, faint as a woman's perfume, the spicy smells of their cargo. He stretched, pushing his shoulders and feet against the cramped confines of his wooden bunk, and then settled back into his blanket. It was hours yet to his watch. If he didn't sleep now, he'd regret it later. He closed his eyes to the dimness of the forecastle, but after a few moments he opened them again. Brashen could sense his dream lurking just beneath the surface asleep, waiting to reclaim him and drag him down. He cursed softly under his breath. He needed to get some sleep, but there'd be no rest in it if all he did was drop back down into the depths of the serpent dream. The recurrent dream was now almost more real to him than the memory. It came to trouble him at odd times, usually when he was facing some major decision. At such times it reared up from the depths of his sleep to fasten its long teeth into his soul and try to pull him under. It little mattered that he was a full-grown man now. It mattered not at all that he was a good sailor as any he'd shipped with, and better than 9/10 of them. When the dream seized on him, he was dragged back to his boyhood, back to a time when all, even himself, had rightly despised him. He tried to decide what was troubling him most. His captain despised him. Yes, that was true, but it didn't make him any less a seaman. He'd been mate on the ship under Captain Vestrit and had well proved his worth to that man. When Vestrit had taken ill, Brashen had dared to hope the Vivacia would be put into his hands to captain. Instead, the old traitor had turned it over to his son-in-law, Kyle Haven. Well, family was family, and Brashen could accept what had been done. Then Captain Haven had exercised his option of choosing his own first mate, and it hadn't been Brashen. Trell. Still, the demotion was no fault of his own, and every sailor in the ship, no, every sailor in Bingtown itself had known that. No shame to it. Kyle had simply wanted his own man. Brashen had thought it over and decided he'd rather serve as second mate on the Vivacia than first on any other vessel. It had been his own decision, and he could fault no one else for it. Even after they had left the docks, and Captain Haven had belatedly decided he wanted a familiar man as second, and Brashen could move down yet another notch, he had gritted his teeth and obeyed his captain. But despite his years with the Vivacia and his gratitude to Ephron Vestrit, he suspected this would be the last time he shipped on her. That, my friends, is one of the early chapters of Ship of Magic by Robin Hobb. And this book has a wonderful cast of characters who, all of them, have flaws. Deep flaws. There are times when even your favorite characters, you might find yourself rooting against them because of their decisions, because of their actions, their words. And there are characters in there that you probably won't like, that at moments you might find yourself rooting for them as they are attempting to undergo certain accomplishments. Now, there are a couple of characters in here that are probably universally going to be hated. I won't name drop any of those names. But my understanding is the series villain in here, who turns out to be the series villain, is not the most villainous person in this book, which is an interesting thing to me. when I found out he was the series villain, I was about halfway through, and I was like, really, him? No. It makes it interesting, and it goes to show that Robin Hobb can write good characters. It is on display in the Farseer trilogy, a trilogy of books that I read in my childhood and loved deeply. I reread Assassin's Apprentice last year and really enjoyed it, and need to finally get back around to hitting Royal Assassin and continuing that trilogy for a reread. But I had the opportunity to buddy read this with Rachel is reading, and since I wanted to read more Robin Hobb, and since this is the next trilogy to read after the Farseer trilogy, I figured why not? I found a copy, and I was able to read along with her through the month of July. And I definitely have some thoughts on this one. I'm going to keep this completely spoiler free. So if you haven't read this, if you haven't read even anything by Robin Hobb, you can stick around and hear the thoughts. I'm not going to spoil anything from the Farseer trilogy. At least in terms of this book itself, there's nothing that you need to know from the previous trilogy to read and enjoy this one. They don't seem to be directly connected in any way, shape, or form, other than they all take place in the same kind of world. Whereas the next trilogy after this, I believe, goes back to follow the main character from the Farseer trilogy. But Ship of Magic has an interesting premise in that there's traders and they're sailing on ships, as you would expect, and that the most lucrative of these ships are known as live ships. So these are ships that are crafted at least in part from wizard wood. Their figure at the front of the ship is definitely going to be made of this wizard wood. And the premise behind wizard wood is that over the course of a couple of generations, the descendants are going to pass along their memories, their experiences, having been on that ship and sailing on that ship and dying on that ship, through to the figurehead of the ship. And so the ship then eventually will quicken, which means it comes alive and can speak and react and has thoughts, emotions, and some control over itself. And this is lucrative because if you have a ship that can sail itself, well, it can work with you. It can help find things that you might miss and avoid danger. It might be able to go faster. In fact, that's one of the things that's highlighted multiple times in here, that a live ship is faster than a normal ship because, well, the live ship's going to work with the normal ship. So, if a pirate was wanting to ambush and board onto a live ship, they would find it to be a very difficult task because they aren't going to be able to catch up to said live ship. And the only people that have live ships are families of traders, of which our main character, I will determine that Althea Vestrit is probably our main character in here, but there's a couple of main characters, including Brashen, who was featured in that little excerpt there. And so the big thing that sets this all spiraling off is Althea's father is sick, very sick. Looks to be like he's not going to make it much longer, but everybody at the start of the book is hoping that he's going to pull through. But instead of Althea, his daughter, who has sailed with him for many years, ever since she was a young girl, has lived on that ship, thinks of it as her home more than her home with her mom and sister. Instead of her inheriting the ship, it's given to the son-in-law, who doesn't necessarily follow all of the same paths and ideas and share the same thoughts and ambitions and goals as the family themselves did. And so that's one of the main storylines that's going on here. And Brashen's is kind of intertwined. As you heard, he was mate on the ship for Captain Vestrit, and now he's kind of been demoted down to third mate and still staying on the ship. Because why not stay on in a third mate role rather than go somewhere else and be first mate on a different ship? So his story is kind of intertwined in there. And Kyle Haven, being the son-in-law who's captaining the ship, is a pretty major character. His son at some point in time is going to come into play. The Vivacia, being a live ship, is going to be a prominent figure in here because live ships are definitely important in this. This is, I believe, the Live Ship Traders trilogy, so live ships are going to be vital in here. And then there's one other really big player, and that is a pirate named Kenneth. And it actually opens with him in chapter 1. I jumped ahead to chapter 2 with him finding some treasure on a cursed island. But he's got a charm that is his luck, and his luck holds true, and he's a lucky guy. So he's a big player throughout, and you'll get some of his chapters mixed in there. Not as often as Althea and Brashen, but his are definitely mixed in there as well. All in all, this is a really, really fun trip. The book itself, this is not a small book. And while it did come to a conclusion that makes sense for all of the major players involved, it does not feel like a satisfying conclusion if one were to consider this as a book on its own. Now, and that's the trouble with a trilogy. I'm assuming this was written as a planned trilogy, and so Robin Hobb probably knew exactly where things were going in all 3 books. And again, it does come to some sense of a conclusion in here. But it's not satisfying in any way, and it leaves wide open. That there's more to be told of this story, and you would think that in a book this thick, it's 809 pages in this mass market paperback. You would think in 809 pages that it would reach at least a satisfying conclusion for the single book, that you wouldn't have to then go and pick up book 2 immediately in order to feel like you are getting closer to feeling satisfied with what has happened. And that is the biggest flaw of this book, is the way it ends, as well as just the characters being unlikable at times, that you're going to root against some of your favorite characters. And that's okay. I think that's actually a good trademark of Robin Hobb, that she writes characters that are believable because they're deeply flawed individuals that make choices that sometimes it always makes sense in the framework of the character, but it's not the one that if you were there picking for them that they would maybe choose for themselves. You can see that trap on the other side of that fence, but the character doesn't see it, and you want to kind of shepherd them away from that poor decision that they're about to make, but they're going to go ahead and move right on through because they're bullheaded about something or they're emotional about something, and they're going to fall into that trap. And that's okay. I think that's actually a good quality in Robin Hobb's writing. I think that's something that people have issues grappling with in the Farseer trilogy, that there's moments in time where the main character in that Fitz is just not as likable, and that things happen that are, it defies what you would expect for the genre norms of a protagonist character. They have more in common with, say, the main characters from A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin, where all of them have moments where they are in the spotlight as being strong characters that you can root for, and they all have moments where they make decisions and do things where you just can't help but recoil a little bit at what they've done, even when it is one of your favorite characters. So in that sense, Robin Hobb has a lot of similarity to something like George R.R. Martin. And I've heard a lot of great things about Robin Hobb. She's been mentioned as a fantastic author, and having now read a fourth book by her, and it's been a long time, remember, since I've read the entirety of the Farseer trilogy. I have to say that Hobb is probably one of my favorite fantasy authors now. Um, I feel like once I finish this trilogy and revisit the Farseer trilogy, I'm going to have no hope of resisting the urge to roll right into the following trilogy after that and just keep on reading through the entire. I don't even remember what the overall entirety of the series is that has all of these trilogies enmeshed in there, but I will have a hard time not continuing. In fact, there's a big part of me right now that wants to go and just toss this down and go pick up book 2 from the store so that I can keep on reading Robin Hobb. Now, I did mention Buddy read this with Rachel as reading, and it was fantastic. She's had some really good thoughts, some good opinions on the book along the way. And she's not ready to dive into book 2 quite yet. She needs, a buffer time before picking up and committing to another long fantasy like this, and that's okay. I have no shortage of books on my shelf that I need to read, so I'm willing to wait a little bit. And it sounds like Beth Ann might be joining us when we sail off onto book 2. But yeah, if you haven't read anything Robin Hobb, start with the Farseer trilogy. I think that one is a fantastic starting point. But even if you decide not to and pick up Ship of Magic, I think you're going to be in for a real treat of an adventure. And just remember, it's a trilogy. You might need to read all 3 of them to feel like it has come to any sense of a satisfying conclusion, and that the characters aren't meant to be perfect and flawless and likable the entire time. And as long as you go into this with that kind of mentality and that understanding, I think you will really enjoy your time in Ship of Magic. I know I did. This was, in spite of its small flaws there, definitely a 5-star read for me. Potentially one of the best books that I've read so far this year. I don't know. It's going to be interesting by the time we get to the end of the year to see how this holds up when I consider all of the books that I've read over the course of the year. But if I had to go with my gut instinct right now, I'd say it's easily in my top 3 of books that I've read this year. So I really enjoyed it. Definitely check it out if you like fantasy and you haven't read a Robin Hobb, or at least haven't read the Live Ship Traders trilogy. Pick this up. It's great.